Welcome to the Forgotten Knowledge Library, where timeless wisdom meets modern reflection. From Stoics to storytellers, we unlock the ideas that shaped and continue to shape our world. So, step into the library and enjoy the journey. Please hit that like button if you're into this, drop a comment about what you'd like to hear next, and be sure to subscribe. Ooh, and ring that bell so you don't miss a thing.
Another deep dive. I think it's safe to say, given you're here, that you're interested in using philosophy and mindset for self-help and self-improvement, right?
Absolutely.
So that's exactly where we're going today.
Perfect.
And for this deep dive, we're looking at Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah, a really interesting choice.
Yeah, and I think one of the most fascinating things about Meditations is that it wasn't like meant to be a published work.
Right.
These are his own like personal reflections.
Yeah, personal journal entries. So we get a sort of unfiltered look into the mind of a Roman emperor.
Yeah.
The pressures of leadership, wrestling with these timeless questions that we all face.
Yeah. I mean, it's just so cool
Yeah.
to get this like window into the mind of someone like that.
Exactly.
And so on this deep dive, we're going to really try to tease out like what are the core philosophical principles that he's grappling with and how can we apply those to our lives today, for self-improvement. We're not trying to be like super academic here.
Right.
It's more about like, hey, let's take these ideas and figure out like, how can we actually use them?
Yeah.
So one thing that really jumps out to me is this concept of like control, like what can we actually control in life?
Yeah, absolutely. And Aurelius draws this really important distinction, right, between what's within our power and what's outside of it.
Yeah.
And, in Book 2, Section 1, he says, that which makes not man himself the worse cannot make his life the worse. Neither can it hurt him, either inwardly or outwardly.
So basically, if something doesn't make you a worse person,
Right.
it can't actually harm you.
Exactly.
So what falls into that category of things we can control?
Well, primarily our internal world. Our thoughts, our judgments, our desires, our reactions.
So it's like our inner landscape is what we have control over.
Exactly, yeah. And what's outside of that circle? Well, external events, other people's actions, our health, our wealth, our reputation, all these things that, to a large extent are subject to forces beyond our direct command.
Mm.
And I think it's so easy to get caught up in trying to control those things.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to force outcomes, trying to manipulate situations.
Yeah.
It's exhausting.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I find myself doing that all the time.
Yeah.
Like, trying to get someone to see my point of view or
Yeah.
stressing about a deadline.
Right.
That, like, I don't actually have much control over.
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind of energy drain that Aurelius is talking about, right?
Mm.
He's saying, redirect that energy inwards.
Okay.
Focus on cultivating your own reasoned responses rather than battling with the uncontrollable.
So it's not about like being passive. It's about choosing where you focus your energy.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that, if we latch onto this idea that our peace of mind depends on external circumstances behaving exactly as we wish,
Right.
well, we're setting ourselves up for a lot of frustration. I mean, even a Roman emperor with all his power
Right.
couldn't control everything.
I'm sure he had his fair share of like difficult people to deal with.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
And in Book 2, Section 15, he gives us a little list of these difficult people.
Mhm.
He mentions, an idle, curious man, an unthankful man, a railer, a crafty, false, or envious man,
Mhm.
an unsociable, uncharitable man. It sounds a bit like a modern-day Twitter feed, doesn't it?
Yeah, a little bit.
Right.
So how did he deal with like all these difficult people?
Well, his perspective is really rooted in understanding.
Mm-hmm.
He suggests that these negative traits, these behaviors, often stem from a lack of awareness.
Okay.
A lack of understanding of what truly constitutes good and bad.
So it's like they're acting out of ignorance.
In a sense, yes. They haven't developed that same understanding of virtue that he emphasizes so much.
So when you encounter those people, like how do you approach that from like a Stoic perspective?
Well, instead of immediately reacting with anger or judgment,
Right.
you try to cultivate a sense of understanding, even pity.
Okay.
You recognize that their actions might be arising from a kind of ignorance.
It's like that person who cuts you off in traffic.
Right.
Instead of getting angry, you try to understand maybe they're just having a bad day.
Exactly. Maybe they're rushed. Maybe they haven't developed that same awareness of, considerate driving.
So you're shifting the focus from your own emotional reaction to trying to understand, like, what might be going on with them.
Yeah. And then, of course, you still have to choose how you're going to respond,
Right.
but you're doing so from a place of greater understanding and hopefully from a place that aligns with your own commitment to remaining calm and rational.
Right. It's about, like, choosing your response rather than just reacting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which brings us to another key idea, which is this notion of living in accordance with nature.
Yeah.
Now, when you hear that phrase, what comes to mind?
I guess my first thought is, like, just doing it feels natural. Just, like, following your instincts.
That's a common interpretation.
Yeah.
But Stoicism takes it a bit deeper. It's not just about acting on impulse. It's about understanding the rational order of the universe and recognizing your place within it.
So it's about, like, seeing yourself as part of this bigger system
Right.
that has its own logic.
Exactly. And Aurelius talks about this interconnectedness in Book 4, Sections 1 and 4.
Yeah.
He says all reasonable beings are created for one another,
Okay.
which I think, underscores our social obligations. The importance of treating others with tolerance and understanding. We're all part of this shared human experience.
It's like this interconnected web.
Yeah.
And we all have, like, a role to play.
Right. But how does this idea of living in accordance with nature apply when things go wrong?
Right. Because bad things do happen.
They do. And that's where the concept of acceptance becomes really important. Aurelius encourages us to accept events as they unfold, understanding that they're part of this larger natural order, even if we don't fully understand the reasons behind them.
So it's like trusting that there is a reason,
Right.
even if we can't see it.
Exactly. And he even presents this idea of what he calls the ordinary dilemma. He says, the universe is either guided by a rational providence, so like a divine plan,
Okay.
or by random atomic collisions.
Okay. So, like, pure chance.
Yeah.
Yep.
But in either case,
Okay.
the events themselves are largely beyond our control.
So it's like either way, you got to just accept what happens.
Yeah. And he goes even further in Book 4, Section 40, suggesting that whatsoever in any kind doth happen to anyone is expedient to the whole. Now, that's a challenging idea to fully grasp, especially when you're going through something difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But the underlying principle is that even seemingly negative events contribute to the overall balance and harmony of the universe.
So it's like there's a bigger picture that we might not be able to see.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, the takeaway here is that instead of resisting what happens,
Okay.
instead of constantly wishing things were different,
Right.
we can try to find a sense of acceptance, even contentment within those
Yeah,
circumstances.
it's about, like, making peace with reality.
Yeah. And, speaking of understanding the universe,
Okay.
another crucial element of Stoicism is the emphasis on reason and understanding.
Okay. I mean, this feels like it kind of underpins everything we've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Reason is the guiding faculty in Stoic philosophy.
Yeah.
And Aurelius constantly emphasizes the need to use our reason to examine our thoughts, to guide our actions.
So it's like engaging that thinking part of ourselves.
Right. And he refers to this as the ruling part of humankind,
Okay.
our reason. And he highlights its inherent power to overcome obstacles, to make sound judgments.
So when you're faced with, like, a tough decision or, a challenge, the Stoic approach is to really think it through.
Yeah, exactly.
Use your reason.
It involves scrutinizing your initial impressions, your opinions,
Yeah.
before you fully accept them.
It's like, don't just react. Like, take a step back and think.
Yeah, and in our modern world where we're bombarded with information, with opinions, this practice of careful examination is more important than ever.
So it's about being, like, a discerning consumer of information.
Exactly.
Both, like, internal and external.
Right. And Aurelius suggests this really interesting technique. He says, consciously describe objects and events to your mind in their most basic form.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
So let's say, you get a critical email that really triggers you.
Okay.
Instead of immediately reacting defensively or with anger, you pause and you describe that email to yourself in the simplest terms. It is a series of words arranged on a screen conveying a certain viewpoint.
Okay.
That simple act of stripping away the emotional interpretation
Right.
can create space for a more reasoned response.
So it's not about denying your feelings. It's about, like, not letting them completely control you.
Exactly. And this leads us to, I think, one of the most central and maybe even radical ideas in Stoicism.
Okay.
And that is the idea that virtue is the sole good.
So wait, are you saying that things like success or health aren't inherently good?
That's exactly what Stoicism teaches. It says that virtue, which encompasses wisdom, justice, courage, temperance, all these qualities,
Okay.
that's the only true and lasting good.
Wow.
External factors, as we talked about earlier, are considered indifferent. They can be used well or poorly, but they don't inherently constitute good or bad in this ultimate sense.
So it's really about like the quality of your character, your actions,
Right.
more than the external circumstances.
Exactly. And Aurelius says this beautifully in Book 3, Section 7. He says, if thou shalt find anything in this mortal life better than righteousness, than truth, temperance, fortitude, apply thyself unto it with thy whole heart. But if nothing thou shalt find worthy to be preferred to that spirit which is within thee, then give not way to any other thing.
So it's really about that inner excellence
It is.
above all else.
Right. And I think this perspective can be incredibly freeing, right? Because if your primary focus is on cultivating your own virtue,
Yeah.
then the pursuit of external rewards and the fear of external losses, they lose their grip on you.
You're not so attached to those things.
Exactly. Your sense of well-being becomes much less dependent on those external circumstances.
So even if things go wrong, if you face setbacks, if you lose things, if you act with integrity, you can still find a sense of goodness in your life.
Exactly. And, the things that we often consider so important, like wealth, health, reputation, they become the arena in which you exercise your virtue.
They're just like the playing field.
Right. It's your choices, how you navigate those circumstances
Right.
that truly matter from a Stoic perspective.
No, one thing I wanted to ask you about, because I think this is where, philosophy really gets put to the test,
Yeah.
is how to deal with other people's actions. Because sometimes people do things that are just like really frustrating
Yeah.
or even hurtful. So how does Stoicism help us with that?
Well, Aurelius offers some really insightful advice here.
Yeah.
And he returns to this idea we touched on earlier of viewing those who transgress against us as, in a sense, misguided kinsmen,
Okay.
acting out of ignorance. So by recognizing that their negative behavior often stems from a lack of understanding, a flawed perspective, we can cultivate a sense of compassion rather than resentment.
It's like trying to see things from their point of view.
Yeah. And he really emphasizes forgiveness and understanding
Okay.
as a more constructive response than succumbing to anger or seeking revenge.
Mhm.
And he has this great line where he says, the best revenge is not to become like unto them.
That's really good.
Because if you react with negativity, you're just perpetuating the cycle.
Right. It's like you're lowering yourself to their level.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in Book 6, Section 25, he encourages us to look into the minds of those who wrong you.
Okay.
By trying to understand their underlying thoughts, their motivations,
Yeah.
even if those motivations are flawed,
Yeah.
we can often diffuse our anger.
It takes away some of that like emotional charge
Right.
when you can kind of understand where they're coming from.
Exactly. And we can respond in a more measured, more effective way.
So it's about preserving your own inner peace as well.
Right. And this leads us to another really important Stoic principle, and that is the awareness of impermanence, the importance of the present moment.
This feels like a really common theme across a lot of different philosophies and wisdom traditions.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Yeah.
And Aurelius constantly reminds himself, and by extension us, of this fleeting nature of all things.
Yeah.
In Book 2, Sections 4 and 12, he reflects on the transient quality of life.
Yep.
He writes, man can part with no life properly, save with that little part of life which he now lives.
Wow, that's heavy.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
I think what he's getting at is that all we truly possess is this very moment.
Okay.
The past is gone, the future's uncertain,
Yeah.
and this understanding of impermanence can really change how we approach our lives.
In what way?
Well, it encourages us to detach from anxieties about the future, which we can't control, and regrets about the past, which we can't change.
So it's like stop dwelling on what's already happened
Oh,
and
I-
stop worrying about what might happen.
Exactly. Focus on what you can do right now.
Be present.
Be present. Exactly.
Yeah.
And Aurelius urges us in Book 3, Section 9, to constantly remind ourselves how quickly things fade away, how all things are in a state of flux.
So it's like remember that this moment is precious.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And this awareness can bring a sense of urgency and appreciation to the present moment, but it can also lessen the sting of loss when things inevitably change.
It's like everything is temporary.
Right.
So enjoy it while it lasts.
Yeah. And building on this focus on the present moment,
Yeah.
I think it's important to talk about the Stoic emphasis on self-examination, and maintaining integrity.
So, like, okay, the present moment is important,
Right.
but how do you make sure you're, like, living it in a way that is true to yourself,
Right.
that aligns with your values?
Well, that's through constant self-reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Aurelius places great importance on striving for this alignment between our principles and our actions.
It's about walking the walk.
Exactly. And in Book 6, Section 12, he cautions against merely being outwardly labeled as good or modest or truthful.
Okay.
True integrity, he says, is about embodying those qualities in your thoughts and your deeds.
So it's not about how other people see you. It's about, like, who you are on the inside.
It's about living authentically.
Okay.
And we need to regularly examine our motivations, our judgments, our behaviors, and make sure they are in harmony with our values.
It's like taking stock of, like, am I actually living the way that I believe I should be living?
Yeah, exactly. And he even suggests this specific practice. In Book V, Section 11, he says, ask yourself, what is your ruling principle, your reason currently occupied with?
Okay.
And I think that's such a good practice because it helps you stay on course.
It's like checking in with yourself,
Perfectly.
making sure you're, like, not getting off track.
Right.
Now, one final key takeaway from meditations, and I know this is one that can be a bit tough to talk about, is the Stoic perspective on death.
Yeah,
Right? And I think Aurelius has a really unique and interesting take on this.
he does.
So, how does Stoicism approach death?
Well, for Aurelius, death isn't something to be feared above all else,
Okay.
but rather as a natural part of the cycle of life.
Like birth and growth and
Exactly, exactly. And in Book 4, Section 5, he describes it as this natural process of the elements resolving back into their source.
Yeah.
He says, matter-of-factly, a thing surely which no man ought to be ashamed of.
So it's like, it's just a natural thing.
Yeah, it's not this tragic end, it's just a natural conclusion.
Okay.
And I think what's interesting is that by accepting our own mortality,
Okay.
we can actually live more fully in the present.
How so?
Well, when you acknowledge that your time is finite,
Right.
it can really motivate you to be more intentional with how you use it.
It's like every moment counts.
It does. And Aurelius points out in Book 2, Section 12, that whether our life is long or short, the experience of it really boils down to the present moment.
So it's not about the quantity of time.
Right.
It's the quality of your experience.
Exactly. So by accepting death as a natural part of life,
Okay.
we can free ourselves from that fear, from that anxiety, and focus on living well right now.
I love that. So just to kind of recap, the core Stoic principles we've been talking about.
Yeah.
There's this emphasis on focusing on what's within your control, aligning yourself with reason and the natural order, recognizing that virtue is the ultimate good.
Right.
Practicing understanding and forgiveness towards others.
Right.
Embracing the impermanence of life.
Yeah.
The importance of the present moment.
Right.
Engaging in self-examination, making sure you're living in accordance with your values.
Yeah.
And then finally, accepting death as a natural process.
It's a powerful set of ideas, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's really a framework for, like, living a good life.
Yeah, I think so. And I think for our listeners, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on which of these principles really resonates with you. What are the challenges you're facing in your own life, and how could applying even just one of these Stoic ideas, how could that shift your perspective? How could that maybe help you navigate those challenges with a bit more grace, a bit more resilience?
Yeah. And to kind of leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Yeah.
How might a shift in your perspective towards what you can control,
Right.
like really focusing on your own thoughts and actions, how could that fundamentally change how you approach your goals, how you respond to setbacks,
Yeah.
how you experience life in general?
I think that's a powerful question to sit with. And remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. Meditations is a text that you can return to again and again. And there's a whole world of philosophical thought out there to explore.
Yeah, so keep exploring. And thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for watching and listening. This episode is just the beginning. We'll be continuing through meditations by Marcus Aurelius, one idea at a time. We'll also be exploring many timeless works, forgotten philosophies, and other fascinating projects. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss anything. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode or channel, and what part of this episode stood out to you. What books, ideas, or questions should we explore next? And hey, what did you think of our hosts? Drop a comment below, and let's build this library together.